Am I good enough? The most toxic question asked by all creatives. Perfectionism gives us anxiety. It's the obsession that our work isn't good enough, and it's the reason that we procrastinate. It holds us back. In this video, I'm going to cover how to understand perfectionism and how to deal with and overcome perfectionism. So if you're fighting perfectionism in your art, watch this video and learn how to overcome perfectionism. Perfectionism gets the best of us. I'm a huge advocate for progress over perfection, because perfection is the inability to balance out our priorities, and this isn't just something that plagues us as artists starting out in the industry, it also affects senior artists alike. For junior artists, it's a result of the inability to see the big picture. They get trapped in their own rabbit hole, not thinking about their deadlines or their workload, and it's easy just to get stuck trying to make things perfect rather than knowing where exactly to focus on. Really, it's the inability to manage ourselves, so we can never really deliver projects on time. Picture accepting an art project from a client, and the client estimates it's going to take about 20 hours to complete, and they want to pay you, let's say, $1,000. So you do the work, and because you're a perfectionist, it's not good enough, it's never good enough, and you can't let it go. So you end up working 40 hours instead of 20 hours. You put in all of that extra work, and what it means is that you still get paid the same amount of money, but if you're paying attention, you've halved your hourly rate. You've halved the amount that you're actually going to get paid. You're now getting paid $1,000 for 40 hours of work, even though you just did twice the amount of work. It sounds small, but when this is a reoccurring thing, eventually your projects become unprofitable. So it means a lot of artists end up working from their own budget, and it means that half of their profit ends up paying for the job itself. So sometimes it means you end up spending so much time on the project that you end up paying the client for the privilege to work on the project in the first place. Meaning that you've burnt through the budget so much that you're now paying for it out of your own pocket. Not to mention delivering the project late, because again, being such a perfectionist, you're working on everything and you're not really paying attention to the deadline, you're not showing them or getting critique, you're not getting feedback from them, so everything gets delayed and delayed and delayed. All of this can be avoided if A, you track your time purely for context, and B, you have a clear target of what you aim to deliver. We all know the quote from Da Vinci, art is never finished, it's merely abandoned. When we're creating art as a business, we have the goal to manage a business successfully and be profitable. We need to know when enough is enough, and when we meet the criteria to abandon the project and focus on the big picture. I speak from experience as both a producer in film as well as a studio owner. The art is not actually so much about doing the work. The art form is actually about how to create exciting work within the constraints that you set for yourself. Meaning, if you give yourself a day, what's the great work that you can turn out in a day? If you give yourself a month, what can you do with a month? Whatever the constraints are, that's the constraints that you're going to be working within to create the best quality work that you can within the time frame that you have. So I hope that you're getting this. I want this to resonate. Your goal is to get better at creating amazing work within the set constraints that you give yourself. It's not about creating exciting work that you can spend weeks, months, or even years on. Because if the work's taken that long to do, then clearly it's moved away from being commercial work to the side of procrastination. I've seen plenty of artists doing amazing work, but it ends up taking weeks instead of days to do it because they keep making excuses, they keep wanting to get away from the work, they keep wanting to take breaks because just clearly they're not into it. They're procrastinating, they're overthinking, they're putting too much emphasis on what the work involves rather than focusing on the big picture of meeting the deadlines and getting the work out the door. How to defeat perfectionism. First of all, have a timeline in mind. Deadlines give you context that allows you to know exactly where to focus and where is important. It also helps you understand how to approach it in the first place. If you have a day to do something, you're going to approach it very differently to if you had a week to do it. And having condensed timelines means that you can get the work done faster. So if you had a week to do something, then give yourself 3 days. Not only will you have the extra time to be able to focus on where you think the work needs the extra attention, because you've got those extra days now to be able to focus on the things that matter. So there's a concept called Parkinson's Law, which means that a task will shrink or stretch given the finite time that we've given it. So we'll shrink or stretch a task to the timeline that we have. So if we have a week to do something, it's going to take a week. If we have a day to do something, it's going to take a day. But you'll be surprised with having condensed timelines how much it allows you to approach everything with much more focus. So Parkinson's Law helps us understand that with condensed timelines, it means that we can get tasks done much faster than we anticipate, provided we give ourselves condensed timelines to do it within. Another really good concept is to start with the end in mind, and this means having clear communication of what exactly you're delivering. So in other words, you don't just accept the job, but you actually communicate back to them what you're going to be doing and make sure that you're both aligned. we're all visual people, and a lot of the time that stuff gets lost in translation when we're using words. One person might say, I want this to be really big and crazy, and the other person assumes that means like really big and crazy, but they're just talking about bigger screen space but not as violent. Like, there's a lot of stuff that can get lost. So the more that you can communicate exactly what you're going to do before you actually do it, the more that we can get fully aligned ahead of time and make sure that we're going down the right path. When you're talking with directors or clients or even communicating with artists, this is really important. So I'm a big fan of doing paint overs as a supervisor, because I'll be supervising artists and I might communicate what I want, and I'm hoping that they understand and they take that and they go off and they deliver it. So in other words, it might take them 3 days, 5 days to create an explosion. And when I finally see it, that's when I'll say, oh, like, that's not really the look I was going for, or I needed to do this, or it needs to be bigger. And as they start to change it at that point, it starts to kind of roll backwards, it starts to fall apart. If I'm able to communicate exactly what I want ahead of time, it means that they know a lot more confidently what they need to do. It also means that if I'm able to communicate that ahead of time, it also means that they're able to get it a lot quicker and a lot more accurately, bang on the first time around. So in other words, if I say I want an explosion, they're going to make an explosion. If I go and get the animatic or something and I'm able to paint over it and say, I want an explosion, I want it like this big, and I want like little bits of fire shooting out, and I'm able to paint all that in 5 or 10 minutes, just a quick little paint over, it's something that then they can look at and they can compare it to their work and make sure that they're hitting those marks, hitting those notes visually a lot more accurately, because I communicated everything ahead of time with the paint over. So hopefully that makes sense, that we communicate visually, but also by starting with the end in mind first, it means that they're able to get there a lot quicker. In addition, you always have something, like I said, to reference, so you can always go back to it and say, is this correct? Because we go down that rabbit hole, we start doing stuff, and then we go look at the original concept, and we're like, oh, yeah, this isn't really what I was told. Kind of went down my own direction here. But by having that reference, you can always look back at that and reference it to say size, placement, timing, all the things that we're trying to communicate. Having a process in place. To build on this concept, there's another concept I incorporate called broad strokes, which means that you get the overall vision down and the overall process locked as soon as possible, and then you go back and you detail everything out. A good example of this would have been back in 2004. I was working at Blur Studio. We had this really cool Warhammer project that we're going to be doing, and it was about a 2.5 week, 3 week turnaround, and because of that, we had a lot to get done. It was this massive sequence with armies of orcs and humans all battling each other, blowing each other up, lots of gunfire, explosions, the whole thing. Now, because we had such a condensed timeline, we didn't have the luxury of going and detailing every single piece and making it perfect. By doing broad strokes, it meant that we're able to block everything out and we could revise and review, revise and review. In other words, we can get closer and closer with the time frame that we have. So, in other words, we would always be looking at composition. If I'm working on an explosion, I want to make sure I render it and I put it into comp, and then I see like, hey, all the detail that I'm worrying about, well, hey, it's blurred out. Actually, its depth of field is actually out of focus, so I don't need to worry about all that extra detail. Or I'm working on the animation, trying to get it perfect, and then when I look at it in comp, it's actually behind a pillar. You never actually get to see it. All of these concepts allowed us to focus on what really matters and focus on what people are really going to notice. A good example of this is that there's these massive armies of orcs running over a hill, gunfire, explosions, and if you look in the background, all the animation of the orcs in the background are literally skating. There are 3 or 4 keyframes just doing this, because we were focusing our time on where your eye is actually going to be. So the hero character has emotion, he's angry, he's in pain, you're able to look at him and see all this detail, this nuance, all the subtleties are there. But the things that you're not focused on, we didn't spend the time on because we didn't have the time. We're focusing our attention on what matters. Broad strokes allow us to see where we need to revise. When things start to become invisible and we don't notice the flaws anymore, it means it's good enough to move on. So we have that 80-20. We focus on the 80% that matters the most. The 20% that doesn't matter is what we throw away. The other thing, especially in 3D when it comes to broad strokes, is that we're able to get it through the entire pipeline. This is really important because I supervise a lot of artists and I see juniors and seniors both make this problem quite a lot, which is that they'll work on a shot. Let's say it's an effect, some really complicated simulation. And they're working on it and working on it and working on it, and it looks really cool, but they haven't ever rendered it out. They haven't put it into the file, they haven't gotten it all set up in context of everything else. Now it's a week away from the deadline and they finally go to render, and that's when it just crashes, or it's too heavy to render in the first place. So suddenly they're troubleshooting and trying to fix it up. They're spending all of their time trying to figure out like what the heck is going on and how do I get it to work? And because of that, they start dialing knobs and trying to get it to work to a point where they've finally gotten it to work, but they've destroyed their file, the look, the whole feeling, everything they put all the emphasis around all the past couple of weeks goes out the window, but they finally got their file to work. This is something that happens all the time. But if we're focusing on broad strokes, it means let's get it in there, block out the timing, placement, size, all the things that matter. Making it look good we'll do later. But it means that we now go into lighting and then rendering. We render it out, we get into comp, we review it, we can see it in that context. Like I said, is it in focus? Is it behind a pillar? All of those things matter, but at least now we can see that it actually rendered. It actually went through the entire pipeline. This is what I call race to comp. So we get everything from 3D into comp, we're able to review it and look at it, and we know that it works. Now the job is to go back and start to revise it and detail it out, exactly how broad strokes work. On a canvas, you're doing the broad strokes, you're getting the layout, the composition right, and once you've done that, that's when you start detailing things out, doing the fingernails, doing the eyelashes, doing the iris, like all the bits and pieces that you can go on to work on until you run out of time. So this allows us to put our time and focus onto the things that matter, but also confidently know that we have something that works. Now, along the way, every time we're rendering and reviewing, if at some point, let's say our file does get corrupted, it does get too big and starts to crash, which again, is 3D, that's the stuff that happens. But at least when that happens, we can say, well, yesterday I rendered it, it worked fine. What changed between yesterday and today? I can always go back and look at the older file, I can compare settings, I can see like, oh, I dialed the sampling up here, I did this thing over here, or I brought in that geometry from Paul or Jim or Claire over there and they screwed up my file. Whatever it is, it allows us to roll back to where it was working, and it means we have the least amount of downtime as possible. So this is extremely powerful. It allows us to get our work done and make sure it goes through the entire pipeline. Then we go back and we revise and detail things out and continue to go through the process. And know that if we ever corrupt anything or anything ever happens, we aren't starting from scratch. We're not scratching our head thinking what the heck's going on. We've got a time mark of when it last worked and now where it's not working. We can compare the two and figure out what the heck is going on, fix it, and keep moving forward. This is something that I cannot stress enough. It's so important in production. The people who follow that concept have a lot more success than the people who don't, because it means you're not wasting time trying to figure out, well, why is this not working? Because you have a staple of when it did work and now where it's not. So go through the whole process first, see it in context, go back and detail things out. Knowing if it breaks, you know exactly where to look. It's also the difference between being able to deliver something or deliver nothing. Delivering something that's 80% there, and if you have more time, you can get it to 90% or 100%. In other words, you're not going and working on something and not really looking at the big picture. So let's say, I'm just going to go back to a drawing or a painting as an example. You might have detailed out the hands with all the hair and the veins and all the lighting, everything feels perfect, but then the rest of your painting isn't as balanced out. Other areas aren't as detailed. And because you're instead focusing on the big picture, it means that you can equally start to iterate and improve on things and start to focus on where the attention needs to be. If you're always looking at identifying with the face, perhaps the face needs to have a lot more detail to it. If you run out of time, then having not as much detail on all the other areas that are probably in shadow or just not really focused on anyway, it's not a big deal. The whole point is to be able to deliver it on time and on schedule with everything else, rather than having something where you abandon it halfway through and nothing is actually complete. So rather than going down the rabbit hole of focusing on one thing and not seeing the big picture, working with broad strokes always allows you to be able to see and put the attention into the things that really matter, and then continue to revise until it's time to abandon that artwork because the deadline's up or the client signed off on it. And again, there's so many times where you might think it's not done, but the client would have approved it 12 days ago and saved you a lot of money. And that money can equal profit. So think about it that way. Again, it's all about being able to deliver where the client is happy and they're able to walk away. And from there, you're able to continue working on your spare time if you want to make it a passion project, but it means that you delivered, the client is happy, which is the main thing. Why you should welcome failure early. I came up with the concept execute, 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 and attack with urgency and fail fast. These two concepts are talked about on my podcast many times. If you don't know about the podcast, check out the link in the description. We have nearly 400 episodes. It's been going for the last 8 years. I've interviewed everyone from the head of ILM to feature film directors and everything else in between, so definitely check it out. The concept of attack with urgency and fail fast means to understand failure is just part of the process. It's like navigating a maze. Failure helps us know which directions are dead ends, and bit by bit it allows us to get closer to our goal. So we can either go down the wrong direction for weeks, or we can attack it with urgency, and we can welcome that failure and look for failure everywhere we go. We're looking for that dead end. We're looking for a reason to be able to iterate and move in the correct direction. So we can try many directions until we find the one that works or the one that looks the most promising, and then we can put all of our attention into that approach. So forgetting the maze metaphor, but hitting walls is part of the process. You don't just effortlessly try something and get it 100% correct on the first try. By understanding that hitting walls and having setbacks, all of this is okay. It's just part of the process. But it's important to spend at least some of the time in these areas. By attacking them with urgency, by looking for things to fail, it allows us to get started fast, have condensed timelines, look for the dead ends, so that way when we know we're in the right direction, we can double down. I see the opposite sometimes. People clearly going in the wrong direction, but because they've spent so much time going down the wrong path, they've refused to start over. And this is called the sunken cost fallacy. It's how many people lose everything through gambling. They're in so deep that they feel they just need to at least make their money back before they can call it quits. Sadly, sometimes we do this with our own work. It's our ego preventing us from accepting defeat and choosing a better path. Having long-term discipline. I love the concept of everyday art. One of my friends, Goro Fujita, he's the director of Quill over at Meta. He introduced me to this a long time ago. I'd heard of speed painting, but seeing his work, which he's managed to track by keeping all of his artwork from day one of starting this, he's able to show me where he was at a few years ago and where he's at now. And seeing the work dramatically get better every single day. What gets measured gets managed, which means that the more that he's able to measure or track all of the progress he's doing, the more that you might feel like you're getting that much better. But then you look back at where you were before, you look at where you are now, and you realize how much you've improved over time. Another one of my friends who's also been on the podcast, Beeple, which I'm sure you're aware of his artwork that he sold in NFT for $69.3 million. He's done this as well. He's tracked all 5,000 at the time, everyday pieces that he's done. And by doing this every single day, it's forcing him not only to get better at his craft, but it's also forcing him to step away. He can't spend a week, a month on a piece of artwork. He's limiting his artwork to 2 hours for that piece, which means that maybe he's gonna get onto it at 10 p.m. at night, and it means he's got those 2 hours before it's midnight, and he's got to post no matter what. And I love this because it means that you can't overthink things. You're gonna do it, you're gonna put your work into it, but at some point, you need to step away from it. So again, these are condensed timelines. It allows us to do our work, get the biggest bang for our buck, and then be able to walk away before getting sucked down that rabbit hole or procrastinating or overthinking things too much. And like I said, the best part is you can always look back at your work and you can see the progress. You can see how much better you're getting over time. You can't do that, and you will always overthink it if you're not measuring, if you're not tracking your work. But by being able to see that VO1, VO2, VO3, or everyday art, seeing each unique piece, you're able to see the improvement over time. I used to do this on a lot of big projects where I wrote a little script so that way if I did a preview or a play blast or whatever of my work, I would keep every single one. So there's times where I would actually go and look at all the different previews that I've generated from the past couple of days, and I could see the work getting better and better and better. Or I could see it starting to plateau. I can start to see that I'm just spinning wheels and I'm not making that progress. So that allows me to kind of kick back into gear and say, okay, I can see the work in the last couple hours is starting to dip, time to get back on track. I love the idea of pottery method, which is the whole concept being that two artists had a day to be able to make this perfect vase. But instead of a day, one of them only had 20 minutes or 10 minutes to make the vase, and they had to make him over and over every 10 minutes. There's different variations of the story, but the concept is always the same. One person spent the entire day making the perfect piece, and the other person had 10 minutes per piece. They had to iterate and iterate and iterate. But because they're not spending so much time making it perfect and spending way too much overtime on it, it means that they're getting better through repetition. So it means by the end of it, when you compare the two, they're actually both pretty comparable. The difference is that when they're asked to go and make another piece, it's going to take a day for that person to do that piece. The other person can just knock it out in 10 minutes over and over and over. By looking at everyday art, it means that I'm able to see the work and see every single one of those and see the progress, the way it improves every single time. All the work iterates over time. That to me is data. Being able to see the VO1, the VO2, the V30, the version 50, each iteration of my work, I'm able to see that improve over time. Being able to see all my failures and documenting them along the way, it means that I'm now able to say, well, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work, so I'm able to avoid those down the line. I'm able to share those lessons with other people as well. So in general, it allows us to grow and allows us to learn from our mistakes, and it means that everything that we're looking at is a chance to be able to grow in the right direction and know what areas to avoid. But even just as a way of habit tracking your work every day, it gives historical data. Are you going in the right direction? All of this is about setting yourself up for the win by building many of these habits to become a better artist overall. Like the song says, let it go. There's another concept in film production called CBB, which is could be better. And it means that when you've finished the project, you can then go back around and look at your CBB list. And that means you can focus on the original goal. This is extremely effective because it means you're able to prioritize where to focus. And part of this means that you're able to work on your shot, your sequence that you're doing, and there's all these additional things that would be really cool to do, but it's easy to kind of go after those shiny objects of, oh, it'd be really cool to have a bit of glimmer over here and a depth of field here, and wouldn't it be cool if we had extra explosions? These are CBBs because you can go and do all of this stuff, and what ends up happening is you never deliver the project because you've focused on the things that didn't matter, that would be cool to have, but by making them a CBB, it means that these are the things that if we have time, we'll go back and address. And it means that we focus on the things that matter, we deliver the project, and with the spare time we have left, that's where we go back and revise and refine and spend that bit of time on the things that we could improve on or we could add if we had that little of extra time. But it means if we don't do those things, it still means that we deliver the project. It still means that we delivered what we promised, and those little shiny things that probably would have derailed us completely, those are the things that we never got to, unfortunately, but at least we delivered the project rather than delivering nothing because we went down that rabbit hole. So the whole idea, again, is 80-20. We want to focus on delivering 80% of the project rather than delivering nothing. The CBBs are great for another reason because we never want to say no to a client. Clients never want to hear no. So when a client instead asks for something radical or completely out of the budget or out of the range of the discussion we've had so far, it's a chance for us to push back without straight up just saying no. Instead of saying no, we could say, absolutely, what we've discussed on X so far, let's focus on getting everything in there that we've discussed first, but if there's any time left in the schedule, we'll definitely try to fit those in as well. What happens is the client feels heard, and you've managed to sideline their request that otherwise could potentially tank the project. They're off in creative land throwing out all these different ideas. You're focusing on delivering what contractually you've been promised to deliver, but it allows you then to say, okay, now I'll do a version with all those silly things that they wanted, and when they see them, they'll probably be like, oh, never mind, I don't want that after all. But the good part is that you delivered everything. And if you ran out of time, you ran out of time. But at least you delivered what you promised rather than getting around to that CBB list. So I typically call this the bonus round, or it can also be called CBB, whatever you want to call it, but it simply means that we'll be able to write down the notes that they ask for that don't really fit with the original brief, and explain that we'll address them as a CBB when we get to it, or we'll put it into the bonus round if we have time left, we'll definitely tackle that stuff. And then if there is time, then they get addressed, and if there isn't time, then there just isn't time. Also, a lot of the time, those ideas that the director or the client or whoever it is requested earlier on, half the time they're forgotten. They were in the moment, they were throwing around ideas, they weren't thinking of the consequences of how many people and how much time is involved to get that done. They're just spitting out ideas and already they've forgotten them a day later. So it would suck if you spent a week going down that rabbit hole, didn't deliver the project, and then went back and said, oh, but I was doing this thing that you wanted, and they don't even remember saying that in the first place. They're always going to go back to the brief and say, no, this is what I wanted. This is the politics of working in film, and this is something that we've always got to navigate. It's also a good way to validate, and this is something that I'll do a lot. If someone brings it up 2 or 3 times, then I know that they actually care about that thing, and they're not just thinking out loud. But if they just bring it up once, like I said, it might be one of those spare of the moment brain farts that they're throwing out there, but they're already moved on and forgotten about it by the end of the day. There's also a lot of other nuances to it, because sometimes it requires more money to do those things, so it's a chance to come back and say that you've looked into that request that they mentioned and it is possible to do it, but it's outside the scope of what they've discussed in the past, so you could fit it in, but it's going to be an extra $5,000. At that point, it's a chance for them to prioritize whether that new idea that they wanted is something that they actually want now that you put a price tag on it. So sometimes it's something that they are really adamant about and they're willing to pay the money for it now that you put a price tag on it. Other times it's just something that would have been nice to have but isn't valuable enough to actually pay for it. So this helps protect you and give you the space to work on what you need to deliver the project on time. It's a chance to avoid disrupting the entire schedule by having these random requests come in. But even as an artist, there are many wish list items that we all want to do. Like, wouldn't it be cool if I went and spent a bit more time over here? But we all sabotage ourselves. We all get in each other's way. So just as much as clients and directors might want to sabotage our project with all of their random thoughts, we also need to distinguish between what our priorities are and what is important to us and where we want to focus our attention. And where are the things that would be nice to do as a CBB, but ultimately we might have to let it go, especially if we want to make our deadline. So just remember, art is never finished, it's merely abandoned. Conclusion. So I hope we all learned this by now. Perfectionism is not pride in your work, it's the artist's downfall, especially in the commercial space. So the more that you do something, the better you get at it. The faster they iterate, the faster you improve. The more that you manage your time, the more that you focus on the end, each project will inspire you to do a better job every iteration. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot from this video. So take a second to leave a comment. I would love to hear from you and I'll do my best to respond. I mentioned a couple of podcast episodes in here. In case you're not aware, we're almost up to 400 episodes. I've been doing the podcast for 8 years at this point, and we've had a lot of amazing guests on, from Autodesk and a lot of other big software companies, all the way through to the heads of studios, as well as visual effects supervisors, artists, as well as people who run studios, directors, the executives at different studios. There's a lot of different guests we've had on, and I love the diversity that we've had so far. So I'm really excited and really proud of everything we've done. Obviously, there's a lot of content in there, so if you're interested in checking it out, I've left a link below. You can go to alanmckay.com/podcast to be able to access it as well. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. That would mean the world to me as well. It'd be a great way to show support for the channel. I put out daily videos around visual effects and how to create a successful career, and the business side of being an artist as well. So tutorials, courses, and so much more. Thanks for watching, and check out some of the other videos recommended above my head somewhere. So thanks again for watching.